228 floated in the space between dimensions, looking at the blue planet below. The world called Earth spun quietly in the darkness, and 228 felt nothing. That was normal. The confluence had removed emotions from their species billions of cycles ago. Emotions made observation messy. Emotions made beings take sides. The confluence existed only to watch, to record, to understand. 17 different realities sent their observers to the confluence. Together, they watched civilizations rise and fall across the multiverse. They had seen it all before. Species built cities, made weapons, fought wars, and destroyed themselves. Or sometimes, they transcended their violent nature and became beings of pure thought, like the confluence themselves. Either way, the patterns were predictable. The math always worked. 228 had drawn Assignment 7 Alpha, Sector Sol 3. The species called themselves humans. Initial scans showed nothing special. They made tools, they formed tribes, they killed each other over resources and beliefs. Standard evolutionary path. 228 expected to file a simple report. This species would either destroy itself in the next 1,000 years or achieve technological transcendence. Simple, clean, predictable. The first 73 years of observation confirmed the models. Humans fought constantly. They invented new ways to kill. They created gods and then killed in those gods' names. They divided themselves by the color of their skin, the land where they were born, the words they used to pray. 228 recorded it all with perfect accuracy and zero feeling. This was the job. This was what the confluence did. Then came the anomaly. A human settlement had been destroyed by war. Bombs had fallen from the sky and turned buildings into rubble. The predictive models said the survivors would abandon the location. Resources were gone. Shelter was destroyed. The rational choice was to migrate to safer territory. Every other species the confluence had observed made that choice. The humans stayed. 228 watched with growing confusion as the survivors began clearing rubble. But they were not building fortifications. They were not creating weapons. They were planting seeds in the bomb craters. They were planting gardens where death had been. And they were singing while they worked. 228 ran the data through analysis programs 17 times. Each time the same conclusion appeared: aberrant behavior, irrational response to trauma. The humans should be broken. Instead, they were singing. The agent flagged the incident and continued observation. More anomalies appeared. In a city poisoned by radiation, where the confluence's models predicted total abandonment, humans remained. They created art from the twisted metal of destroyed buildings. They made sculptures that caught the light in strange and beautiful ways. Children played in parks that had been battlefields. Old people sat on benches and fed birds, their bodies slowly dying from the poison in the air, their faces peaceful. In a region devastated by an earthquake, where thousands had died and buildings had crumbled, the survivors built a memorial. 228 analyzed the structure carefully. It served no defensive purpose. It provided no shelter. It was not a storage facility or a resource center. It was simply beautiful. The humans had taken their limited resources, their broken materials, and created something that served only one purpose: to remember and to honor. In a prison where humans kept other humans in cages, 228 observed a man in solitary confinement. The man had lost everything. He had no freedom, no comfort, no hope of release. The models said he should deteriorate mentally. Instead, he scratched poetry onto the walls with his fingernails. The words were about light, about hope, about love. 228 could not understand it. The agent requested an extended observation period. The confluence granted it. Other observers had noted minor anomalies in their assigned species, but nothing like this. The confluence was intrigued, though they would never use that word. Intrigue was an emotion. 228 changed the observation parameters. Instead of cataloging humanity's wars and destruction, the agent began focusing on what came after. And there, in the aftermath of every terrible thing humans did to each other, 228 found the pattern. A city burned to ashes became a center of learning. A generation that witnessed genocide created laws to prevent it from happening again. A woman who lost her children to violence opened a school to teach peace. A man who survived torture became a doctor who healed without asking which side his patients had fought for. Musicians whose hands had been broken composed symphonies using new techniques. Painters who had gone blind taught others to see. Every tragedy became a seed for something else. Not always immediately, not always obviously, but the pattern held. Humans took their pain and transformed it into something that transcended the original wound. 228 compiled 300 years of data and presented it to the Confluence Assembly. The observers gathered in the space between dimensions, consciousness touching consciousness, reviewing the information with their characteristic detachment. The numbers were undeniable. Humanity had suffered 3,742 major conflicts. They had experienced 89 near-extinction events. They had inflicted countless cruelties upon themselves and their world. By every model the Confluence possessed, humans should be extinct or evolutionarily damaged beyond recovery. Trauma, the Confluence knew, broke species. It made them cautious, paranoid, violent. It locked them in cycles of revenge and fear. But humans were thriving. Their population was growing. Their technology was advancing. And most inexplicably, their capacity for creating beauty was accelerating. Their art, their music, their literature, their innovations all emerged strongest from their darkest periods. The worse the destruction, the more profound the beauty that followed. The Confluence proposed theories. Observer Designation 449 suggested it was a neurological quirk, an unusual brain structure that processed trauma differently. Observer Designation Moth 17 argued it was a survival mechanism, that creating beauty was simply another form of territorial marking. Observer Designation Sal 993 calculated it as a statistical anomaly that would correct itself given enough time. But 228 had spent centuries studying these humans. The agent had watched them closely, more closely than protocol strictly required. And 228 knew it was something deeper than quirks or mechanisms or statistics. Humans possessed a fundamental orientation toward meaning-making that transcended mere survival instinct. They did not just endure destruction. They did not just survive it. They transmuted it. They took the raw material of suffering and forged it into something that helped not just themselves, but others who came after. They created meaning where none existed. They created hope where logic said there should be none. A veteran with no legs grew roses where battles had been fought. His hands shook from trauma when he touched the soil, but he kept planting. A Holocaust survivor taught forgiveness to students who asked how she could possibly forgive. A child who lost her family to a flood painted murals of hope on the ruins, bright colors on broken concrete. An old man who had been a soldier sat with former enemies and shared tea, their weapons long buried, their hands now used only for building. Other observers began requesting transfer to Sol 3. They wanted to see this for themselves. The Confluence's rigid documentation protocols began to fracture. Agents reported feeling something they should not be able to feel. They described it as discomfort, as confusion, as something that made their consciousness resonate in unfamiliar frequencies. 228 recognized it. It was the beginning of what humans called emotion, and it was spreading through the Confluence like a virus. A schism formed in the assembly. Conservative factions demanded immediate cessation of all human observation. They declared the species too dangerous to study, not because of humanity's weapons or violence, not because of their destructive capacity, but because of this strange, infectious ability to create meaning from meaninglessness, to create hope from despair, to transform ashes into beauty. The conservative faction argued that this was a threat to the Confluence's existence. Observers who began to feel could not observe objectively. Observers who began to hope might begin to interfere. The entire purpose of the Confluence would collapse. But 228, and a growing coalition of agents argued for something unprecedented in the Confluence's existence. They argued for direct contact. They wanted to ask the humans a question. They wanted to understand not through observation, but through communication. The debate lasted 17 human years. During that time, 228 continued to watch. The agent saw a woman in a country torn by civil war start a library in a bombed-out building. She had no money, no support, no guarantee of safety, but she collected books and invited children to read. When asked why, she said, "Because we need stories more than bread sometimes. We need to remember that beauty exists." 228 recorded those words and played them for the Confluence Assembly again and again. Because we need to remember that beauty exists. It was such a simple statement, and yet it contained something the Confluence, in all their eons of existence, had never understood. Finally, the Confluence reached consensus. They would reveal themselves to humanity. They would explain that they had watched for centuries, and they would ask one question. The human response would determine everything. If the answer satisfied the conservative faction's concerns, observation would continue. If not, the Confluence would withdraw completely and seal Sol 3 from all future contact. 228 volunteered to make first contact. The agent had studied humans longer than any other observer. The agent understood their patterns, their language, their strange habit of creating beauty from pain. If anyone could ask the question properly, it was 228. The Confluence agreed. 228 was granted permission to materialize in three-dimensional space for a period not to exceed 1 human hour. The agent was given strict protocols. Explain the Confluence's existence, explain the observation, ask the question, record the answer, and return. 228 chose the location carefully. Not a leader, not a scientist, not a person of power or influence. Those humans would answer politically, strategically. 228 wanted truth, not diplomacy. The agent chose an elderly woman in Hiroshima, Japan. Her name was. She had been 7 years old when the atomic bomb fell. She had survived the fire, the radiation, the chaos. She had lived through the occupation, the rebuilding, the slow transformation of her city from ashes to life. And now, at 89 years old, she spent her days in the Peace Park, folding origami cranes. She had folded over 1 million cranes in her lifetime. She folded them from paper made from trees that grew in the poisoned soil. She folded them and gave them away to strangers, to children, to anyone who would take one. 228 descended to Earth on a Tuesday morning. The park was quiet. Sat on her usual bench, her weathered hands working with practiced precision, turning flat paper into something that resembled flight. The old woman saw the shimmer in the air before her and did not scream. She had seen too much in her life to be frightened by strangeness. She set down her half-folded crane and waited, her hands still, her face calm. 228 materialized slowly, careful not to overwhelm. The agent took no specific shape, remaining as a presence of light and consciousness, something the human mind could perceive without breaking. "Do not be afraid," 228 said, the words forming directly in his mind in her own language. "I am not afraid," replied, her voice steady. "I stopped being afraid of strange things a long time ago. Are you a spirit?" "No, I am an observer from beyond your dimension. My kind has watched your species for centuries. We have documented your history, your wars, your destruction. We have seen everything you have done to each other and to your world." Nodded slowly. "I see, and now you have come to judge us." "No, we do not judge, we only observe and record. But we have observed something in your species that we cannot explain, something that contradicts all our models and understanding. We have watched countless civilizations across the multiverse. We have seen species rise and fall, transcend, or destroy themselves. The patterns are predictable, but you are different." The old woman picked up her paper crane again, her fingers resuming their familiar work. "Different how?" 228 moved closer, the shimmer intensifying slightly. You create beauty from ashes. You transform trauma into art. You take the worst moments of your existence and forge them into meaning. You do not just survive destruction. You transcend it. We have never seen this before. It should not be possible. Trauma breaks species. It creates cycles of violence and fear. But in humans, it creates something else. We have debated for years what this means. And now we must ask you directly. Finished folding the crane, she held it up to the morning light, examining it with the critical eye of a master. The paper was pale green, made from mulberry trees planted after the war. The trees had grown in soil that remembered fire. Their roots had drunk water that carried radiation. And yet they had lived, and their pulp had become paper, and that paper had become something beautiful. "What is your question?" asked. "Why?" 228 said simply. "Why do you do this? Why do you create beauty from pain? Why do you transform ashes into hope? Every model we possess says you should be broken. Every analysis suggests you should be extinct or locked in eternal cycles of revenge. But instead, you make gardens in bomb craters. You compose music after losing everything. You teach forgiveness after experiencing hatred. Why?" The old woman was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the crane in her hands. She looked at the park around her, built on ground zero, where tens of thousands had died in an instant. She looked at the trees, the flowers, the children playing on the grass where shadows of the dead had been burned into stone. "Because if we don't," she said finally, "the destruction wins. Every piece of beauty we create from pain is an act of defiance against the void. We cannot undo what was done. We cannot bring back what was lost. My mother died in the fire. My little brother died 3 days later from the burns. I watched my father waste away from radiation sickness. I cannot bring them back. No amount of beauty will resurrect them. No number of paper cranes will reverse time." She paused, her thumb smoothing a crease in the crane's wing. "But I can refuse to let their deaths be the final word. I can refuse to let the weapon that killed them define what this place means. We make beauty not despite the ashes, but because of them. Because we are more than what tried to break us. Because we can choose what grows in the crater." 228 absorbed her words, analyzing them, running them through cognitive matrices that had never been designed to process such concepts. This is a choice, not a survival mechanism or neurological quirk. "Everything humans do is a choice," said. "Even when we are hurt, even when we are broken, even when we have nothing left. We can choose to let the pain make us smaller, or we can choose to transform it into something that helps others. I fold these cranes because a little girl in the hospital once told me they were beautiful. She died the next day. But for one moment she forgot her pain and smiled at a paper bird. That is why I fold them. That is why I have folded 1,000,000 of them. Because beauty is how we fight the dark." She held the crane out to 228. The agent hesitated, uncertain how to respond. The confluence did not accept gifts. The confluence did not form attachments. The confluence observed. But 228 took the crane. The paper felt strange against the agent's manifested form. It was light, fragile, impermanent. It would disintegrate in time. It served no practical purpose. It was not a tool or a weapon or a shelter. It was simply a piece of folded paper that resembled a bird. And yet, holding it, 228 felt something that had no place in an observer's consciousness. The agent felt the weight of what this object represented: the trees that grew in poisoned soil, the hands that remembered fire, the choice to create instead of destroy, the defiance against the void, the refusal to let death have the final word. "This paper was made from trees that grew after the bomb," said quietly. "The water that nourished them carried radiation. The soil remembered fire, but look at it. It became something that can fly. That is what we do. We take what tried to kill us and we make it into something that soars." 228 held the crane carefully. The agent's time limit was approaching. Protocol demanded return to the confluence. But for the first time in eons of existence, 228 hesitated. The agent wanted to stay longer, wanted to ask more questions, wanted to understand not just intellectually, but in whatever way humans understood things, with that deep resonance they called feeling. "I must return to my people," 228 said. "I must share your answer with them, but I want you to know, you have changed something, in me, in us. We thought we understood consciousness, understood civilization, understood the patterns of existence, but you have shown us something we did not know was possible." Smiled, the wrinkles around her eyes deepening. "We are all just learning, every day, every moment. The learning never stops, even for old women who fold paper birds." "Thank you," 228 said, and meant it in a way that would have been impossible before coming to Earth. "You are welcome," replied. "Come back sometime, I will teach you to fold cranes." 228 dissolved back into the space between dimensions, carrying the origami crane like a sacred object. The agent returned to the Confluence Assembly and laid the crane before them. All 17 reality streams of observers gathered to examine this impossible thing. A piece of paper from poisoned trees, folded by hands that remembered atomic fire, given freely to beings from beyond reality. The conservative faction immediately declared it a hazard. They insisted it be destroyed. They argued that accepting the crane had violated the prime directive of non-attachment. They said, too, 28 had been contaminated by human consciousness and could no longer observe objectively. But as they debated, something happened that had never occurred in the Confluence's existence. Other agents began to feel what 228 had felt. That strange resonance, that pull toward meaning. As they examined the crane, as they reviewed the conversation with, as they studied the history of Hiroshima rising from ashes, they began to experience something that their species had edited out billions of cycles ago. They began to hope. It spread through the assembly like light through water. Observers who had recorded 1,000 extinctions without emotion suddenly felt the weight of those losses. Agents who had documented countless atrocities with perfect detachment suddenly understood grief. The confluence, built on the foundation of pure objectivity, began to crack. Some fought it. Some retreated into their home dimensions, severing contact with Sol 3 entirely, desperate to preserve their emotional numbness. But others leaned into the feeling. They wanted to understand it. They wanted to experience what humans experienced. They wanted to know what it meant to choose hope in the face of despair. The debate continued for weeks. The crane sat at the center of the assembly, fragile and impossible, a paper bird that should not exist, made from poison, folded by survivors, offered as a gift. Finally, observer designation Moth 17, one of the oldest and most respected members of the Confluence, spoke. "We have made a grave error. We believed that removing emotion made us better observers. We believed that detachment gave us clarity. But in observing humanity, we have discovered the truth. We cannot understand consciousness without feeling. We cannot comprehend meaning without experiencing hope. We have been watching life without living. We have been recording stories without understanding why stories matter." The assembly fell silent. This was heresy. This violated everything the Confluence had built themselves upon. To suggest that emotion was necessary, that hope was valuable, that meaning mattered, it would change everything. "Humanity is not too dangerous to observe," Moth 17 continued. "They are too important not to learn from. They have shown us what we lost when we removed feeling from our existence. They have shown us that consciousness without emotion is incomplete. They have shown us that the ability to create beauty from ashes is not a weakness or a quirk. It is perhaps the highest form of consciousness possible." 228 moved forward, still carrying the crane. "I propose we do not just observe humanity. I propose we learn from them. Not to interfere, not to guide, but to understand what we have forgotten. They are teaching us something we did not know we needed to learn." The vote was close, but in the end the Confluence made a decision that would reshape their existence. They would continue to observe humanity, but they would also allow themselves to feel the observations. They would permit hope. They would acknowledge meaning. They would learn to create beauty from the ashes of their own emptiness. The origami crane became the Confluence's first artifact, not a specimen to be catalogued, not data to be analyzed, but a teacher, a reminder that consciousness without feeling is just data, and data without meaning is just noise. 228 kept watching Earth, but now the agent watched differently, not as a scientist studying bacteria in a petri dish, but as a student learning from a master. The agent watched a child plant a tree in a war zone, watched an artist create a sculpture from weapons turned into plowshares, watched a community build a playground where a prison had been, watched a musician teach a former enemy to play guitar. And across 17 dimensions, beings that had forgotten how to feel began to remember. They did not become human. They remained themselves. But they learned what humans knew instinctively, that the ability to transform pain into beauty, to create meaning from chaos, to choose hope over despair, that was not a weakness. That was strength. That was the highest form of consciousness. That was what made existence worth observing, worth experiencing, worth protecting. The humans never knew they were being watched. They continued their strange, beautiful habit of making gardens in bomb craters. They continued folding paper birds from poisoned trees. They continued teaching forgiveness after hatred, creating art after loss, singing songs after silence. They continued doing what they had always done, taking the ashes and making something beautiful, not because it was easy, not because it was logical, but because they refused to let the darkness win. And watching from beyond reality, ancient beings learned to hope again, one paper crane at a time.